I stared in disbelief at the gaping holes on my display shelves, where my prized vintage collection pieces once rested. A sinking feeling washed over me as I realized several items were missing after last night's family gathering. Why does peace in this house always disappear with more than just the guests? I muttered to myself, running my fingers along the empty spaces. Nolan, my husband, sauntered into the living room whistling a tune. "Morning, babe. What's got you so focused?" he asked casually, planting a kiss on my cheek. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. Some of my vintage items are missing. Again. He glanced over at the shelves with a dismissive shrug. "Are you sure? Maybe you just misplaced them." My hands balled into fists at his nonchalant attitude. This wasn't the first time valuables had mysteriously disappeared after having his sister Lila over. "No, Nolan, I distinctly remember the Tiffany lamp being right here," I said, pointing to the empty spot, "and the antique jewelry box was on this shelf." He let out an exasperated sigh. "Alara, you're being paranoid again. Why would anyone in our family steal from you?" My blood boiled at his blind trust. "Because it only happens when Lila visits. This has been going on for too long." Nolan's expression hardened. "My sister would never do that. She's family, for God's sake. Stop accusing her of stuff without proof." I could feel the anger rising, my voice growing louder. "Then where are my things, Nolan? I'm not imagining this." He held up his hands in surrender. "Look, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, but you can't just point fingers at Lila. That's not right." Gritting my teeth, I fought back tears of frustration. How could he be so oblivious to the obvious pattern? If only he'd listen instead of immediately defending his sister. Nolan pulled me into a hug, but I remained stiff in his embrace. "Everything will be fine, babe. Let's not ruin the day overthinking this, okay?" As he walked away, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong, and for the first time, I started questioning who I could really trust. The disappearances weighed heavily on my mind over the next few days. Every time I passed the empty shelves, a sinking pit formed in my stomach. I couldn't shake the sneaking suspicion that Lila had something to do with it. Nolan remained frustratingly oblivious, brushing off my concerns with his usual "Lila would never" defense. But the patterns were too obvious to ignore. When Lila called to invite us over for dinner that weekend, I decided to finally confront her. Nolan objected, afraid I'd cause unnecessary drama, but I was determined to get answers. The moment we arrived at Lila's apartment, the tension was palpable. She greeted us warmly, but I caught the briefest flicker of unease in her eyes when they met mine. Over dinner, I struggled to make small talk, my mind fixated on how to broach the subject. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Lila, I need to ask you something," I began, setting down my fork. "Have you been taking things from my house?" The question hung in the air, thick with awkwardness. Nolan shifted uncomfortably beside me, Lila's face contorted with rage. "Excuse me, how dare you accuse me of something like that?" "It's just, things keep going missing whenever you visit," I pressed on, trying to stay calm. "My vintage pieces, jewelry, antiques. And you automatically assume I stole them?" She spat, slamming her hand on the table. "That's a low blow, even for you, Alara." Nolan jumped in, ever the mediator. Now, let's not get carried away here. Lila, sis, you know Alara doesn't mean any disrespect." But Lila wasn't having it. She turned her venom on her own brother. "Oh, so you're taking her side on this? Unbelievable." The shouting escalated rapidly, with Lila hurling accusations of me poisoning Nolan against his own family. Nolan tried in vain to calm the situation, but I could see the conflict tearing him apart. "You're my wife, Alara, but Lila is my sister," he pleaded, his voice strained. "I can't take sides here. You both mean everything to me." In that moment, I realized the harsh truth. No matter what proof I gathered, Nolan would never fully believe me over his beloved sister. The blind trust was impenetrable. As Lila continued her tirade, violently denying any wrongdoing, I felt a profound sense of hopelessness wash over me. How could I make Nolan see what was right in front of his eyes? The dinner ended in disaster, with Lila storming out and Nolan following close behind, shooting me an apologetic glance over his shoulder. I sank into a chair, drained and utterly alone. If they refused to listen to reason, I'd have to find another way to expose the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Nothing was more important than protecting what was rightfully mine. After the disastrous dinner with Lila, I knew confronting her directly was useless. Nolan's blind trust in his sister was impenetrable, no matter how much evidence I presented. If I wanted to prove her guilt, I needed to take matters into my own hands. The idea came to me a few nights later as I sat numbly staring at the empty shelves. I would set up hidden cameras around the house to catch Lila in the act. It was risky, but at this point, I was desperate for answers. Nolan eyed me suspiciously as I scoured the internet for the best hidden camera options. "What are you up to?" he asked cautiously. "Just looking into some home security stuff," I replied nonchalantly. "You know, for peace of mind." He seemed satisfied with that explanation and didn't press further. Little did he know I was gearing up for an all-out sting operation. The tiny cameras arrived a few days later, and I spent an entire evening meticulously positioning them throughout our living spaces, tucked into bookshelves, camouflaged in potted plants, even angled down from the ceiling corners. When Lila called to invite us over again the following weekend, I politely declined, insisting we host at our place instead. The perfect opportunity to put my plan into action. Lila arrived bearing a tray of pastries, all friendly smiles as if our previous blowout had never happened. Nolan was overjoyed to have us all together again, oblivious to the tension still simmering beneath the surface. As the afternoon wore on, I kept one eye on Lila at all times, watching her like a hawk for any suspicious behavior. She sipped her tea casually, laughing at Nolan's jokes and showering us with family anecdotes. Just when I began doubting myself, she excused herself to use the restroom. The moment she disappeared down the hallway, I noticed her purse left unattended on the couch. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, pulling up the hidden camera feed from the living room. To my utter disbelief, the footage showed Lila swiftly unzipping her tote and sliding something inside before heading to the bathroom. White-hot rage coursed through me, but I struggled to maintain my composure when she reemerged minutes later. How dare she steal from me in my own home, right under our noses? As Lila and Nolan chatted amiably, I fought to keep my expression neutral. The burning urge to confront her then and there was overwhelming, but I knew I needed Nolan to see the proof for himself. All through dinner, I could barely touch my food, my mind racing at the implications of what I'd witnessed. Finally, after they'd left, I hurried to review the camera footage more thoroughly. The recordings left no room for doubt. Lila had systematically pilfered various items from around our home, stashing them in her oversized bag. I felt sick watching the looped clips of her sneaky thievery. When Nolan returned from walking his sister out, I was consumed with conflicting emotions. Anger, sadness, and a perverse sense of vindication at finally having the truth laid bare. "We need to talk," I stated firmly, fumbling to keep my voice steady. "I have something to show you." The moment of truth had arrived. With shaky hands, I queued up the video footage from the hidden cameras, my heart pounding in my ears. Nolan watched silently as the clips played out, showing Lila brazenly stealing from our home right under our noses. "Well?" I demanded once the video ended, searching his face for any shred of acknowledgement. "Did you see what your precious sister did?" Nolan's expression was unreadable as he stared at the blank screen. I don't know what to say." "Say that you finally believe me." I exploded, all my frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. "I knew she was behind this the whole time, but you never listened." He flinched at my outburst but remained maddeningly calm. "Alara, this is a lot to process." "What's there to process? The proof is right in front of you. Your own sister has been robbing us blind, and you did nothing to stop it." Guilt flickered across his features, but he quickly regained his composure. "Look, I get that this looks bad, but there has to be some reasonable explanation." I recoiled in disbelief. Even with irrefutable evidence staring him in the face, he still couldn't bring himself to fully accept Lila's betrayal. "Unfreaking believable," I sputtered, throwing up my hands. "How many more excuses are you going to make for her, Nolan?" "I'm not making excuses," he shot back defensively. "I'm just trying to understand why my own sister would do something like this." The absurdity of his denial was maddening. As the screaming match escalated, I felt my righteous anger morphing into utter hopelessness. He was never going to see reason, no matter what I said or did. "You know what? I'm done," I stated firmly, cutting him off mid-rant. I've wasted too much time and energy trying to open your eyes. Grabbing my purse, I stormed towards the door, desperate to escape the suffocating tension. Nolan chased after me, pleading for me to stay and talk it through like rational adults. There's nothing left to talk about, I snapped, whirling to face him one last time. Your loyalty to Lila is more important than your loyalty to me. I see that clearly now. Nolan opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to die on his lips. We both knew I was right. I can't do this anymore, Nolan. I just can't. With those parting words, I walked out, slamming the door behind me with finality. As I stormed down the street, tears of rage and anguish streaming down my cheeks, one thought reverberated through my mind. If Nolan wouldn't cut Lila out of our lives, I would cut them both out of mine. No more games, no more empty promises. The gloves were finally off. The days following my explosive confrontation with Nolan were consumed by a whirlwind of pain and anger. I alternated between fits of uncontrollable sobbing and bouts of white-hot rage at his inexcusable betrayal. How could he stand by and allow his own sister to violate my trust like that, and then have the audacity to make excuses for her reprehensible behavior? It was unforgivable. I knew I needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. After a week of holing up alone, licking my emotional wounds, I finally summoned Nolan for a face-to-face reckoning. He arrived at the apartment with red-rimmed eyes and a haggard expression, clearly bracing himself for the inevitable storm. I wasted no time with pleasantries. "This marriage is over, Nolan," I stated bluntly, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "Unless you cut Lila out of our lives for good." He recoiled as if I'd physically struck him. "Alara, you can't be serious. She's my sister, my family." "She's a thief and a liar," I shouted, all pretenses of civility crumbling. "And you chose to defend her instead of your own wife." Nolan ran a shaky hand through his disheveled hair. I never meant to make you feel that way. You know I love you." "Clearly not enough," I scoffed bitterly. "Not if you're willing to let her walk all over me like this." An uncomfortable silence stretched between us as Nolan grappled with my ultimatum. I could see the tormented conflict playing out across his features. Finally, he met my gaze, his expression hardening with resolve. "You're asking me to choose between you and my own flesh and blood. That's not fair." White-hot fury blazed through me at his oblivious words. "Not fair? You have got to be kidding me." "Lila is troubled, I'll admit that," he pressed on defensively. "But she's still my baby sister. I can't just abandon her, Alara. I need to be there for her, even when she screws up." I shook my head in stunned disbelief. Even now, he was making excuses for the inexcusable, rationalizing away her abhorrent actions with talk of family obligation. "You're unbelievable, you know that?" I spat out the words like venom. "After everything she's put us through, everything she's put me through, you're still choosing her side." Nolan's shoulders sagged in resignation, and I could see the fight slowly draining from his eyes. "I'm sorry you feel that way. Truly, I am. But this is my life, my family. I can't change that." In that moment, I realized our marriage was well and truly broken beyond repair. The trust, the bond we once shared, it was all shattered into pieces by his sister's despicable greed. Meeting his mournful gaze one last time, I spoke the words I never imagined I'd have to say. "Then I want a divorce." The decision to divorce Nolan was gut-wrenching, but I knew it was the only way to regain control over my life. As the dust settled, a newfound determination took root within me. If Nolan and Lila thought a few stolen trinkets were the extent of their misdeeds, they had another thing coming. I started digging deeper into our financial records, emails, anything that could shed light on their shady dealings. And what I uncovered was even more appalling than I could have imagined. It became abundantly clear that Lila's sticky fingers extended far beyond my personal belongings. Bank statements revealed repeated cash withdrawals and unexplained charges on our joint accounts. Credit card bills showed thousands spent on luxury items I'd never purchased. The more I unraveled, the sicker I felt, realizing the depth of their betrayal. This went far beyond emotional violations. They had been robbing me blind financially for years, all while playing the happy family charade. When I finally mustered the courage to confront Nolan with the damning evidence, his reaction was a grotesque mix of guilt and defensive dismissal. "Look, I knew Lila was going through a rough patch," he stammered, unable to meet my withering gaze. She needed help getting back on her feet, so I lent her some money here and there. My hands shook with rage as I slammed the stack of documents onto the table between us. This isn't just lending money, Nolan. This is full-blown theft and fraud. He flinched at my raised voice, eyes desperately scanning the paperwork, as if hoping to find an excuse. Any excuse. I was going to pay it back, I swear, he muttered weakly. Lila promised she'd get her life together soon. I laughed derisively at his pitiful claim. How many times had I heard that empty promise before? Wake up and smell the betrayal, Nolan. Your precious sister has been using you as an enabler for who knows how long, and you let her bleed me dry without a second thought. The words hung heavy in the air, their weight finally seeming to penetrate his delusional bubble. Nolan's face crumpled with the first flickers of real remorse. You're right, I'm so sorry, Alara. I never meant for any of this to happen. But I was beyond apologies at this point. My mind was made up. Save it. I'm taking you both to court for emotional damages and every last cent you've stolen from me. Nolan's eyes widened with panic, but I was done playing nice. If airing their dirty laundry in public was the only way to make them face consequences, so be it. You can't be serious, he sputtered. That'll ruin us. Like you ruined me? I shot back icily. I'm done being the doormat, Nolan. It's time you and Lila paid your dues. As I gathered my things to leave, Nolan made one final desperate plea. Alara, please. We're family. Can't we work through this? But I simply shook my head, my mouth setting into a grim line of finality. We were a family. Not anymore. See you in court. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I strode into the courthouse with my head held high, ready to finally put an end to Nolan and Lila's web of deceit. As I took my seat across from them, I could feel the weight of their accusatory glares burning into me. Nolan leaned over, his expression a mix of pleading and lingering resentment. Alara, it's not too late to drop all this madness. Think about what you're doing to our family. I met his gaze with steely resolve. I am thinking about my family, myself, the one you both betrayed and stole from for years. Before he could respond, the bailiff called the court to order. I sat up straighter, focusing my attention on the judge with an anxious thrill. It was really happening. The proceedings kicked off with Nolan's lawyer making an impassioned appeal to preserve the sanctity of family bonds. I fought back the urge to scoff out loud at the hypocrisy. When it was my turn, I wasted no time launching into the cold hard facts. Bank statements, credit reports, receipts galore laying out the forensic trail of their misdeeds in damning detail. Your Honor, the evidence here paints a clear picture of prolonged financial exploitation and blatant disregard for marital trust, my lawyer stated, gesturing to the paper trail. My client has been a victim of systematic theft and deception at the hands of her own husband and sister-in-law. Nolan and Lila's lawyer sputtered feeble objections, but I could see the weight of the truth steadily sinking in around the courtroom. It was Lila's turn on the stand that really obliterated any last shreds of sympathy. She emerged defiant, spewing bitter diatribes about her dire circumstances and how I had driven her to such desperate acts. That ungrateful shrew had more than enough, she sneered in my direction. She just couldn't bear to share a slice of her precious little pie with family in need. Nolan cringed with shame while I watched her unravel with a strange sense of vindication. Here was the real Lila, the manipulative, grasping leech who had deluded us all with her act. When it was my turn, I refused to rise to her taunts. With quiet dignity, I laid bare the profound emotional devastation, the irrevocably shattered bonds of trust. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive the people I loved most for this calculated, relentless campaign of deception and greed, I said, locking eyes with a squirming Nolan. Some betrayals cut too deep to simply move on. As I stepped down, a heavy silence hung over the courtroom. Even Lila seemed to shrink a bit under the weight of the ugly truth now exposed to the world. After a merciful recess, the judge returned to render his verdict. I sat motionless, barely breathing, as he methodically outlined the shocking breadth of misdeeds and emotional damages. When he finally awarded me the full financial restitution and emotional damages I'd sought, it felt like a profound weight had lifted from my shoulders. Justice finally served. Nolan and Lila's expressions crumbled with the shameful realization of their public downfall as the court spectators began murmuring in hushed judgment. Catching Nolan's devastated stare, I felt nothing but a hollow numbness. There was no more anger, no swell of victorious elation, just emptiness. As I walked out into the crisp Seattle air, I understood that this courtroom triumph was only the first step towards rebuilding my life from the ashes of betrayal. The weeks following the court verdict were a whirlwind of activity. Between finalizing the divorce, sifting through the financial restitution, and fielding the seemingly endless requests for interviews and statements, I barely had a moment to catch my breath. Despite the public victory, picking up the pieces of my shattered life proved unexpectedly daunting. Simple acts like walking through the home Nolan and I once shared dredged up painful memories at every turn. The ghosts of our betrayals hung thick in the air. When the opportunity arose to sell the place at a hefty profit, I jumped at the chance for a fresh start, somewhere unburdened by the weight of the past. My new condo downtown felt Spartan and unfamiliar at first, but I relished the blank slate. With each new addition, a cozy armchair here, a vibrant piece of art there, it began taking shape as a sanctuary solely of my making. Speaking of fresh starts, my career underwent a renaissance as well. Emboldened by my courtroom vindication, I took the settlement money and made the leap to pursue graphic design full-time as my own boss. No more dimming my light for anyone else's comfort. It wasn't always easy, chasing down new clients and projects. More than once, I caught my confidence wavering before replaying Lila's sneering insults in my mind's eye. That malicious entitlement would only propel me further. The real test came when news traveled of Nolan and Lila facing their own personal fallouts in the wake of the divorce drama. Nolan's previously thriving accounting firm let him go, ostensibly over conflicts of interest. Lila, in turn, was forced to move clear across the country in disgrace after being unceremoniously cut off. Any sane person would have relished such poetic justice. Yet when I imagined them brought so low, scraping the bottoms of their selfish existences, I felt nothing. No rush of smug satisfaction, no sense of karmic vindication, just emptiness. I realized then that as much as they'd irreparably wounded me, I didn't owe them another ounce of my emotional energy, not a shred of resentment or bitterness. Nolan and Lila had already taken enough. It was time to fully shed that spiritual weight and focus on nurturing my own renewal. With each new client landed, each project successfully completed on my own terms, I felt lighter, more attuned to the joys of self-determination. Why had I spent so long dim-witting my talents and fortitude for the comfort of those who never truly valued me? That's not to say there weren't setbacks or moments of wistful sadness. Holidays and family gatherings took on a melancholy tinge at first, devoid of the normal raucous clan antics. But over time, I found peace in cultivating my own chosen family of supportive friends and peers. As I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown loft, sipping coffee while the radiant Seattle skyline blinked awake, I could feel the world's possibilities stretching out in front of me, vast and invigorating. The shackles of deception were gone, replaced by a rebirth of authenticity and self-reliance. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was truly, blissfully, unequivocally free.